back to our series here at Eau Claire about spiritual lessons that we can learn and just life lessons we can learn from the battle that Canadians know as Vimy Ridge. And today what we want to look at is learning from the disasters of the past. And that's precisely what the Canadian generals in charge of this battle were going to do. Now, they didn't want to be in charge of the Canadians at first, especially Julian Byng, who became the commander of the forces, the Canadian Corps, at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And he didn't necessarily want the assignment to begin with. But when he got there and saw the potential within this group of soldiers, he began to care for him. And one of his main subordinates, who took over for him later on, was Arthur Currie, who later became Sir Arthur Currie. And he was the general in charge of the Canadian Corps later after Vimy. But before Vimy, they wanted to find out what was really going on. Now, before Vimy Ridge, some of the battles that took place in 1916 were the battles of the Somme, which took place from June to November of 1916. And the Allies lost, the British specifically lost, 600,000 men who were killed or no longer fit for combat because their wounds were so severe. Included in that was 24,000 Canadians. Now, Canada was not a big nation at this time. It's still not really a big nation with population. It has lots of space, but not necessarily lots of people. But at that time, it was even smaller. This is about the equivalent of the entire city of Sherbrooke, Quebec, wiped out over a span of 5 or 6 months. No longer fit for the army. So Byng did not want to repeat those kind of mistakes. But first, you got to find out what mistakes there were. And so he assigned the task of determining the mistakes and overcoming them to this man, Arthur Currie. Now, Currie was not your typical frontline general or general in World War I, period. Most of them had sharply trimmed mustaches, clean pressed uniforms, real fit and austere physical physique. Whereas Currie was just kind of this portly big guy, clean shaven. He didn't have the trim mustache. One of the nicknames they called him was Guts and Gators, because that's what he wore. That's who he was. But he decided to go and do some research. And one thing that he did is he asked a lot of questions. And if you've ever studied business, especially the business books of Jim Collins, you realize that the best companies over the past 200 years are not afraid to ask questions, to go forward. They're not afraid to let go of tactics or ideas that, even though they're part of the original founding of the company, were dragging them down. And so Currie didn't just stop the brass. See, a lot of the generals in World War I didn't live anywhere near the front. And very few of them actually even would visit the front. And so they were wondering, why? What is going on with these battles? Our men, they must be cowardly. There must be something wrong with the men. And so they blamed the men. So Arthur Currie just wasn't satisfied with that. He dug deeper and he learned from the mistakes of the past. So what was some of the things? In fact, he's just known for being ruthless in how he would ask questions. And he found out there was a common theme amongst the men. And he even got to join in with the French in the Battle of Verdun, which the term the industrial meat grinder comes from. That's where the Germans decided, well, we can't really advance anymore. So let's just build really good defensive weapons, really strong fortifications, and just kill as many of the enemy soldiers as possible. And that's what it was becoming as they sent wave and wave upon soldier. In some cases, more men died in a single day in Verdun than entire fronts in the next war. It's crazy to think about the slaughter. So Currie's observing this and he sees different things and he's asking all different ranks. He's not just asking the generals. He's going down to the lowest private and finding out what went wrong. And he found out some things, ways that Canadians could avoid unnecessary casualties. And we're going to see them later on because these are some of the keys to winning the battle. And I believe it's a lot of the spiritual keys that we could apply this spiritually to win the battle for Jesus Christ in our nation and throughout the world. And I just want to highlight a few of them right now. We're going to spend a lot of time on them because each one of these is going to have kind of their own section later on in this series. But one, every man should be told the details of the plan. The only thing they weren't told was the date. You know, that's actually part of Christianity. We're supposed to work together as a team, and we're all supposed to be engaged with actively promoting Jesus Christ. Not just the pastors, not just the evangelists, not just the trained theologians. All of us are supposed to be trained in the needs and how to meet people's needs and how to point people to Jesus. How to explain what the Bible's all about. What do we do in church? Everybody should be engaged in that. Maps were given to section leaders. Now, this is crazy talk at this time period. Why would you give a map to a section leader? They're not really competent enough to lead a lot of men. But Currie would alter that plan, and so would his leader, Julian Byng. And every section leader, leading only about 5 or 10 men, had access to a map. So that if the chain of command started to break down because officers were getting wounded or killed, there was always still somebody to take over. And that's happened in the church. Might not seem like it here right now in Canada, but there have been times in history where the pastors were targeted and thrown in jail. It was up to the church to continue to spread the gospel. And so that's something important. They also didn't show initiative in the Somme. They weren't allowed to. Soldiers were not allowed to show initiative. They were just supposed to blindly follow their commanders into the hail of bullets and artillery shells. In fact, in the Battle of Somme, they were using tactics from 200 years earlier, just men slowly standing in a line, marching forward, which was really, really easy for a machine gun to take out. So the Canadians became known for actually encouraging initiative on the battlefield. Is your church the kind of church that encourages initiative, or does it have to stick to a set program, a set of rules? There has to be some flexibility there. I love it when people stop my service and interrupt and say, hey, can I ask a question? And it's about theology or just one of the words you just read. I love that. That's super fun. And another thing that they had to do, they had to cut the barbed wire. The men would go out and the barbed wire wasn't cut, and it would slow them down and they'd get tangled, and they were just targets for the enemy. And we need to know what the barbed wire is in our life that entangles us. And the last part they learned from the battles of the Somme and Verdun is don't just send raw recruits into the battlefield. You have to train them up. Yes, they had basic training, but they needed to experience and be trained in the ways of combat. And we can liken that to discipleship, and we will be doing that in a few lessons down the road. So how does all these real, and there's other things that we're going to see that they discovered with other men as well, but these discoveries of Arthur Currie, how does that apply to us as followers of Jesus on mission to the world? Well, in the New Testament, there's many references to the failures of people in the past. Hebrews 3:12 to 19 shows us how the Israelites in the wilderness, they floundered again and again due to their unbelief. Even though the pillar of fire is there at night and the pillar of cloud is there by day, they still struggle with unbelief. And it's a warning to us not to follow that pattern. We actually have Christ dwelling in us by the Holy Spirit. So we shouldn't be struggling with unbelief. And so we can't enter into the rest that God has for us. We're just stuck in worry, or we're complaining about what we don't have. Jude also warns about people who had crept into the church. And I just want to read what Jude, Jesus' brother, wrote us. And he tells us about people who had crept into the church. The original point of Jude, he wanted to write a letter just to encourage you in the faith. He said, I got to warn you about these guys that have, and women that have crept into the church. And they're just full of themselves, and they're full of wanting to please themselves. They're not full of the Spirit. And this is what it says. How terrible for them, for they followed the way that Cain took. For the sake of money, they have given themselves over to the error that Balaam committed. And they have rebelled as Korah rebelled. And like him, their faith, and they are destroyed. Peter and James also point us back to this proverb. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Have we had disasters throughout the Canadian church? I would say we've had our fair share. We definitely know of disasters in the American church. As Canadians, we have a tendency of pointing out their flaws, but we've had the same kinds of bad decisions. You know, the church, some churches were involved in severe prejudice towards other groups. We've had poor representation, literally towards the poor in some places, where we just focus on ourselves and our own needs. Some churches were just really just like that, focused on us four and no more. So I wonder how many times we need to learn from those kind of mistakes. Absolutely we do. Do we need to learn from we're going to look and see how to learn from those mistakes. But right now I just want you to be open that we're not perfect. We can learn from the mistakes of people's past so that we don't have to repeat the same mistakes that they did and suffer in our own time period. That's suffering needlessly. As Christians, we might have to suffer for Jesus, but there's no sense in suffering needlessly because we just stubbornly stick to our ways that we've always been taught. How often has greed or pride or the need to be right in a conversation hindered the gospel? You may win the argument, but lose the person. Let's do better than that. So we've failed at times in the church. I just say it right out, in Canada. Are there lessons we can learn like Currie learned about the Somme and Verdun? And we're going to be looking at some of those later on in this series. I keep referring back to that because it's really exciting for me to see this and go, oh, we have so much potential. Yes, we might be a little rough around the edges, some in our churches. And some of them might be so prim and proper that how in the world can they fight in a combat zone? They're so spit and polished. But God, you know what? If the Canadian soldiers could take Vimy Ridge, God can use a church like us. Because we have God on our side who's working through us. So let's be those kind of people that we're okay looking and learning from our past. We're not going to judge the past. We're going to learn from their mistakes. We're going to move on, and we're going to do that impossible task because Jesus is doing it through us, and we can do it together. Hey, thanks for joining me. Have a great week. God bless.